Jeff, I would like to start by just introducing you a little bit. Um, Jeff O'Driscoll, after decades of silence, award-winning author and international speaker Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll shares his spiritual experiences from the emergency department. He saw souls leave their bodies at death and communicated with them. Dr. O'Driscoll's otherworldly experiences began in childhood after his brother died in a farm accident. After stepping away from clinical medicine, Dr. O'Driscoll published his compelling memoir, Not Yet, which I have not yet had the chance to read, but I hope to, and stepped into his practice as an intuitive mentor, connecting each client to their highest self and their most authentic life path. So I would love to dive into any one of those possible veins of gold. The first thing I want to say is that I had the opportunity to interview Jeff Olson just last week. And a couple of weeks ago, I went on the journey. I had had an emergency surgery a few weeks ago and really revisited my own near-death experience that I had when I was 17. And I've been on this journey of integrating, it's been an evolutionary process of integrating that. And so prompted by my emergency surgery, I started listening to near-death experience accounts, because back when I was 17, there were very few people talking about it. And the people that I talked to about it were somewhat overwhelmed. It was out of their scope of understanding. And so that is what led me to Jeff Olson. And then I happened to hear an interview or a presentation given by both of you where you were comparing or laying your two experiences side by side. So given that, you know, Jeff had this car accident that led him to a near-death experience at the scene, and then an out-of-body reconnection with his youngest son, who died at the scene just a week or so before he left the hospital. Can you kind of weave together what those two experiences, how they overlapped?
Yes, Jeff and I have been dear friends now for over 20 years, and so I know what happened to him fairly well. He was involved, as you mentioned, in the car crash, and it took the life of his wife of 10 years and his 14-month-old son, and it nearly took his life. It crushed his legs. He ultimately lost one of his legs and caused a lot of other injuries. Interestingly, though, he didn't have any head injuries. And he was taken to a local hospital and then put on a plane and flown to my trauma center where I was working. And when I went in to see him in the trauma center, he was unconscious and other providers were taking care of him. I didn't have responsibility for his medical care. But as I entered the room, standing above him in the air was his deceased wife, Tamara.
Mm-hmm.
And she filled the room with light and glory, and she communicated her profound gratitude to me for what was being done for her husband. And I had a lot of, this is what people in the field call a shared death experience. And there's a lot of similarities between these and near-death experiences. For example, we could communicate telepathically, and I could see in all directions at the same time. And I had some knowledge about him, about Jeff and his wife, Tamara, although I'd never met them before. And then Jeff went on to the operating room, and I went back out in the ER and finished my shift and never expected to see him again. But as it turned out, we met again a month later, and it was only then that he was able to talk, and we were able to communicate, and I learned that he'd actually had a near-death experience at the scene of the accident. He'd left his body and risen up above the car where he encountered his wife in perfect glory, and she told him, "You need to go back and raise our son." So in a sense, as he was saying his goodbye to Tamara in a profound way, I was saying hello to her.
Right, right.
And Jeff and I have been friends now for uh, over 20 years, and we speak together frequently, and we've shared other spiritual experiences as well.
Wow. Now, that was not the first time that you had had that type of spiritual experience. Tell us a little bit about how you came to that point.
I never thought much about my spiritual experiences as such. I just thought they were kind of normal things that everybody experienced until I started to talk about them. And then I realized that not everybody had these experiences. And people started to ask me that very question. When did these things start for you? And what do you attribute this to? And it was only then, as I was writing my book and began speaking to groups, that I started to ask myself those questions. And I think it all goes back to my brother, who died in a farm accident when I was 11. And within a few years of his death, I started to get messages. Sometimes they were very direct. On one occasion, I was driving a car. I was 16 years old. It was after dark. It was a narrow, windy road, and I had two people in a Volkswagen Bug going 60 miles an hour with no seatbelts.
Mhm.
And a voice spoke to me and said, "You need to slow down." And for some reason, I listened, and I went around the corner and hit a Cadillac head on. And there was a lot of damage, but no one was injured. And I think I may have died that night had I not listened to that voice. And in retrospect, thinking about it, I didn't recognize it as my brother's voice, but looking back, I think that's who was speaking to me.
Right.
And so those things happen more frequently and in a more significant way over uh, several years. Even before I got into medical school, I was having some of those experiences. And then uh, along the way, it gradually transitioned to sometimes I'd see the messenger that was delivering the message. And but it felt natural because it just kind of grew along seemingly organically without me making a real effort to make it happen. And so when I had that experience with Jeff's wife, Tamara, it was wonderful. It was special, but it wasn't new or terribly unusual for me.
Right. Right. It's an odd gift to integrate into a medical profession. It's like um, the medical model is that your job is to fix and put back together and to keep together at all costs and
Right, right.
literally at all costs. And um, how how did you how did you feel as you attempted to weave together that awareness of the spiritual aspect to your work, or how did that integrate with your role as a physician that was to uh, focus on quantity rather than quality?
Right. That's probably one of the reasons I never spoke about my experiences while I was practicing. Um, but I never viewed them as being contradictory or mutually exclusive. I viewed it more along the lines of medical school taught me how to take care of the physical body and virtually left alone the whole notion of having a spiritual body. And my experiences, uh, my intuitive experiences, were more about how to care for the spiritual soul than the physical body. And they rarely seem to go crossways with each other. I remember on one occasion, a gentleman came in. He was a young man. He'd laid his motorcycle down when a car stopped abruptly in front of him, and he kind of slid across the road and bumped into a curb and was not felt to be seriously injured. But the paramedics dutifully strapped him to a board and drug him to the emergency department to get evaluated. And I looked at his helmet. It had a few scratches, nothing serious. He was wearing full protective gear. He denied any pain or injury. And I went through the normal medical protocol to assess his head and neck to see if he needed any x-rays or a scan. And according to all medical protocols, he didn't need any imaging studies. And I was about to let him get up and leave when I just had this feeling that he needed a CAT scan of his head. It was this knowing in my mind that he needed a CAT scan. And I talked with him about it. In fact, he joked about Oh, go ahead, doc. Order the test we don't need, and let's get it over with so I can go. So I ordered the CAT scan, which I would normally get back in 20 to 30 minutes. And about 15 minutes later, I got a call from the radiologist, and he was accumulating blood inside his head so rapidly they could see it swirling. The radiologist could see the blood swirling. I went down to see the young man, and he was already getting sleepy. And because I worked in a trauma center, I was able to call a neurosurgeon who took him up to the operating room in the next 15, 20 minutes, drained his blood, and he was probably back on his motorcycle in a couple of weeks.
Right.
And if I had followed medical protocol and ignored the impressions I received, he almost certainly would have gone home and died that night.
Right. Right. I know that currently, um, well, my journey started out as a labor doula, doing labor
Right,
coaching.
right.
And throughout my counseling practice, it was always serving people at transitional moments. So, uh, divorce, grief, uh, teenagers, babies being born. It was all these important transitional moments that now that my hair is grayer, more often it's uh, at the opposite end of the life spectrum. And
Yeah,
being present with my own friends and others, I mean, throughout my life, there have been those opportunities where you bump into death as a teacher about how to live life fully. And I remember when I had a trilogy of losing my grandmother, a dear friend of mine who lost their youngest little boy drowned in their hot tub just a couple weeks prior to his first birthday, and then a dear college friend of mine who several years later I learned had passed. So it was, you know, someone that you can justify their death, my grandmother, a baby that you can't even imagine because you envision this long life. And then a peer, where it bumps you into your own mortality, that led me to do training with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross during her life, death, and transition workshops. So here I am at this point in my life, really recognizing that death still is such a foreign topic.
yeah.
People are
It's been
afraid.
looked at only 5% of medical schools. The last time I looked at the statistics, only 5% of medical schools have a course in death and dying.
And
Talk about denial.
yes, and it's kind of the same thing with nutrition. You know, it's like you guys don't get that much training in nutrition yet. That kind of is what drives this body. But how, I feel so compelled now to help people not only understand the practical physical way of preparing for your death by having your advance directive and learning how to be an advocate and having the support that you need and understanding what your choices are. I mean, I know that I feel so grateful to live in Washington State, where, you know, we not only have the right to choose assisted death, but you can be composted. You can, you know, there are just all sorts
Right. Yeah.
of conversations that are expanding about death. How how do you hold death at this point, as because it's something that so many people are afraid of? How do you hold it for yourself?
Uh, Mind you, I'm talking now about myself,
Yes.
right? I'm not talking about my view that I imposed upon patients or other people of how they should view death. I'm merely talking about myself for this in answer to your question. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
Um, I've always believed that we were eternal beings, that we existed before we were born, and that this life is a continuation of an eternal spectrum of existence, and that we continue to live after death. And I look forward to the exciting new realms of discovery and opportunities that lie ahead. Now, having said that, I still want to live life to the fullest. I don't want to die prematurely. I'm not suicidal or anything like that. But there's no fear in the process for me.
Right. Right. I I concur. It's where, since my near death experience, I that evaporated that fear, and initially, and I'd say for many years, it was the frustration. Jeff Olson talked about it as well, about that frustration of being back in your body,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
heavy and dense the body feels being back. And for the longest time, it's like, why did I have to come back? Kind of through my Catholic filter, it was somehow I'm being punished for being back. I didn't
Right.
do a good enough job at something. Um, so it's taken me a long time to drop the religious indoctrination and let the spiritual part of it blossom.
Right. A lot of people, in my opinion, mistakenly confuse religion with spirituality.
Right.
And they think that religion teaches spirituality, and too many religions think that they are teaching spirituality. And it's been my experience that the two may cross paths often or travel parallel paths at times, but in fact, they're very separate things. And you don't have to be religious to be spiritual. And you don't, a lot of religious people are not very spiritual.
Right, right, right. Um, how, given that physicians aren't taught about death and dying, and you worked in emergency trauma, so you probably face it more than many doctors do. How I've had the experience of some doctors who are so afraid to have that conversation.
Yeah, some of them are. And I think that's very unfortunate because the physician is frequently the person that people look to for a conversation about this. They may look to an ecclesiastical person, a clergyman, for some spiritual preparation for death. But when they want to understand the physical nature of death and the process of dying and what they might look for in their near future, the physician ought to be willing to have that conversation and help them have expectations and make plans for a smooth transition, in my opinion.
Yeah, because no one gets out alive. It's like we have two shared experiences for sure, and that's birth and death.
Birth and death. And so now, are you a death doula?
Well, more times, more and more often, I step into that role.
See, I view birth and death as two sides of the same coin.
It's the same portal.
Yeah, the same portal we're passing through. We're going one direction at birth and the other direction at death. And so for me in the emergency department, I frequently had profoundly spiritual experiences when people were born as well as when they died.
Yes. Yeah.
And the way I think about it is whatever this veil, this separation there is between this life and the other, uh, during birth and death, that veil's drawn back and a soul passes through, either entering or leaving their body. And if you're in close proximity, spiritual proximity, that is,
Right.
some of that light and glory gets to spill onto you for a moment and you get to experience with the person.
Right.
And sometimes if that veil's drawn back far enough or held open long enough, you might peer in there. You might even see somebody you recognize
Yeah.
that preceded you in death. And so I view birth and death as very similar phenomena, and uh, we don't need to fear either one.
Right. My experience has been that it's the most phenomenal um dual experience of physically being out of control and spiritually being absolutely surrendered. It's like, if I hadn't been at a birth for a while, I'd be hungry to be at a birth, because this little person would come in and you would know, old soul, new soul,
You're right.
would
Yeah.
be this incredible challenging opportunity to see the power of women to be with their body in this process that overwhelms. And it's so unpredictable. You can have an incredibly detailed birth plan that totally takes a different course, and yet still having that process of writing your plan, thinking about your plan, it all connects you with what you want, not only physically, not only having pretty curtains on the wall, but to me it's that spiritual opportunity. And I see that with the death process as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned how widely divergent these experiences can be.
Yeah,
Because I talk with a lot of people in the near death community, and some people really struggle with the notion that all near death experiences are not alike. And they think that somehow undermines the validity of the experience.
right,
Uh, but you think about it, if somebody's born uh, in poverty-stricken sub-Saharan Africa, they're not going to have the same birth experience as somebody that's born at Cedar-Sinai hospital, right? We don't expect anybody's birth experience to be the same. So why should we expect their death experience to be the same?
right, right. Yeah, I agree. And somehow it mixes with that awareness that we don't always get what we want, but we always get what we need. Like somehow, regardless of what that experience, some people have easy births, some people don't. Some people have easy passing, some people don't. And buried within the highs and lows of each of those are incredible opportunities for growth. And
Right,
we're kind of caught in this crazy duality of good, bad, right, wrong, high, low, light, dark. That's the challenge of maneuvering this experience. And like I told the other Jeff, that when I was born, I think like you, very early on, I had different experiences than other people, but I thought everybody was having my same experience.
right, yeah,
So it was like being born into a world where everyone is playing the game of Monopoly and they had been issued the rules to the game of Monopoly. And I came into a world playing the game of Monopoly, but I was issued the rules to the game of life.
right,
I couldn't
right.
figure out why it wouldn't work, you know? Um, so, how do we, just having gone through a really intense emergency experience, I know that when people say, "Are you afraid of death?" I said, "No, I'm just afraid of the what I my fear was of what I experienced a few weeks ago, of that total out of control, being in pain, not having the people that I wanted close by." Um, how do you suggest we prepare people for the uncertainties of a death experience so that it's not anxiety driven?
Oh, that's a big question. And the reason that's such a big question is because the preparation in some ways is different for every single individual. Consistently, the most difficult thing I did for me as an emergency physician was tell someone their loved one had died.
Yeah.
And the reason it was so difficult is because I couldn't learn a proper way to tell somebody that and have it be applicable in all different circumstances to all different people. Everybody wanted to be told in their own way. Everybody wanted, every circumstance required a different view and approach. And so it was really hard to spiritually try and discern how to say what needed to be said. And so to relate that to your question, everybody prepares for death in a different way. But certainly talking about it for most people, in my experience, has been powerful and meaningful. I
Mhm.
had a good friend who was quite a bit older than me, and she was approaching death. As I recall, she had pancreatic cancer. And I'd known her and her husband for quite some time, and she sent her husband to come get me. She said she wanted a blessing, and she wanted me to come bless her. And I honored her request, and a day or two later, I showed up at her house, and we had a nice visit. And before I left, I offered a special blessing upon her. And as I started to do so, some other uh, power, some spiritual source took over for me. And in the blessing, she was promised that her deceased loved ones would soon come and start comforting her and instructing her and preparing her for transition.
Mhm.
And I could feel it as it was being said. And I just wanted to stay there and experience it with her, but I knew it was for her, not me. And so I excused myself and left. And he called me, the husband called me the next morning and said, shortly after I left, her deceased loved ones started showing up and visiting her and strengthening and comforting her. Um, so I think it's important as we get closer to death that we start to open up ourselves to the possibility that we're not alone and that there'll be somebody to help us. In fact, there's a physician, he's a hospice physician, his name's Chris Kerr, and he does research in what he calls end of life visions and dreams. And if you want a good brief summary of his research, you can pull up his TED Talk and watch it.
Uh-huh.
And he talks about how people, as they get closer to death, they almost always have visions and dreams or other experiences. And they almost always feel like they're being prepared for something. Usually it's loved ones that come to them. The experiences are almost always pleasant. They get more frequent and more profound as they get closer to death. And he's compiled a bunch of this research about how people from the other side often help us transition.
Yeah, I remember sitting with my grandmother in the hospital, and she was certain that she wanted to go home to die. So when I was sitting with her in the hospital, she would talk to above her bed, saying, "Not yet, quit singing. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I'm going to go home." So it was getting her home, to my parents' house where she lived, and she passed at home, but they were there,
Yeah.
singing and making too much noise for her.
Yeah, my father-in-law died about 2 years ago, and he was at home. He was on hospice care. He was perfectly alert and oriented right up until near the end. And for a few weeks, his wife would often sit next to him and say, "Oh, how am I going to live without you? What am I going to do when you're gone?" And she'd say things like this. And then one day, she sat near him and she said, "I'm going to be okay. If it's time for you to go, you can go." And within hours, he passed.
Right,
And I literally think that he stuck around until she was ready,
right.
until she said, "It's okay, you can go." And then he went.
Yeah. I just recently, last July, had the experience of my closest soul sister friend passing of rectal cancer. And she lived 15, just 15 minutes. She was in Idaho. She lived 15 minutes from the state line, where in Washington, end of life assistance would have been available to her. And it was quite a journey. We were on the journey of getting her a Washington state address, because initially she was in so much pain that was not managed well by the hospice that she originally had. And then we got her better palliative care, but it was still a very unfortunate end for her. The night she passed, it was where at about midnight there was a thunder and lightning storm that came through. And I know that that's when her spirit left her body, and her body continued on really struggling until about 10 o'clock the next morning. But I can tell you the instant, in that dramatic way, and that was just the way Mary would have done it.
Yeah.
And
Well,
since she's always come as a hummingbird. It's
I walked into the ER one day to start my shift, and I was logging onto the computer when I felt a spiritual presence. And it was this profound vibration, if you will, that started in the center of my core and radiated out to the tip of each extremity. And I'd had enough experiences like that I knew what it was. And this spiritual being asked me for help. And I just walked past the resuscitation bay on my way to the workstation, and I knew that my colleague and a team was trying to resuscitate a woman in the adjacent room. And I knew that it was her that was communicating with me. So I walked around the corner into that room. Now, I had absolutely no responsibility for her care. I have to make that perfectly clear. Another doctor and the whole team was taking care of her. All I did was walk over near the gurney and rest my hand on her leg, just to feel her presence more clearly. And as I did that, she asked me if she could leave.
mm-hmm.
And I first thought, why would you ask me that? And why would you think I'd have an answer? And then something came into my mind, and I communicated silently back to her. Mind you, this is all silent. She's literally intubated, receiving chest compressions. She's unconscious. And I communicated back to her that I thought if it felt right to her and she thought it was the right time, then it was probably okay for her to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And she rose up out of her body and she stood in the air above the gurney, and she looked about half the age of the body she'd just come out of. and she filled the room with glory and light, and she thanked me for what I'd done, and then she left.
Mm.
And as I walked out of the room, I heard the physician behind me in military time pronounce her time of death. And I thought, oh, yeah, I know. I saw her leave. And I
Uh-huh.
went over and logged onto the computer and started my shift. That's how my day began that day. So
Wow.
when you say when the thunderstorm rolled through and you felt her leave,
Yeah.
I resonate with that because I've had those experiences more than once.
Yeah. Now, given that you know of out of body experiences and near death experiences, and sometimes where people show no signs of life, um, and then come back. So, as a physician, how do you know when to pronounce death?
uh, with very rare exceptions, when I was practicing medicine, and I've stepped away from clinical practice now, I'm not seeing patients anymore. But when I was practicing, I adhered strictly to medical protocols.
Mhm.
I rarely had spiritual experiences when I was taking care of my patients because I was caught up in making a diagnosis, prescribing appropriate care. Uh, if it was a code or a trauma patient, I might be putting in a chest tube or intubating or doing some procedure. And I was so caught up in the science and the medicine and the physical that there wasn't any room for things spiritual, it seems.
Right.
And so um, I just followed what I was taught the vast majority of the time. And it was only on a very, very rare occasion I'd get a feeling or an inkling that, maybe go down this path. Why don't you check this and just be sure? And so I
Right.
tried to honor that.
Right. What I've had the opportunity to be with a couple of different people on that journey of assisted death, and one woman in particular who had lived for who had been a professional dancer who was diagnosed with MS and lived for 15 years in a care facility here, and we would a whole circle of us would help in her care, and with a couple of experiences with aspirations, and she just finally, I don't know how she made it as far as she did down that journey. But it was an amazing, being at a birth or being at a death, it is such it's not only the opportunity for the person who is passing, but for everyone in the circle, it's such an honor, uh, a growth stretch to be at a passing. And so hers was the first assisted passing that I had been at, and she had thought about every detail and fortunately got to fulfill the majority of the details that she had envisioned. And I thought it was so cute because one of the things that she wanted, we took her out of the care facility to a friend's home to ingest the cocktail. And um, she wanted the EMTs in our local small community, they waived the expense of transporting her to this home. And one of the things she wanted was cute EMTs. And they sent two EMT teams, but the lead team was women. And she was thinking, well, next time around, I'm going to have to be a
Be
little
more
better about
specific.
manifesting, be more specific. Um, but it was an incredible experience to be with her because it was a 9-hour process from the time she ingested before the time of her passing. But what I felt so strongly was after the first 30 minutes and she was unconscious, when we rolled her over on her side, her arms were free. And that was the first time that we had seen her in 15 years with her chest open. And I think she just wanted to enjoy being in a body that wasn't restricted anymore, you know?
Yeah.
But if you would share with me your thoughts on that process of assisted death.
Yeah. Let me share a few things leading up to that. Because there's some things I think are very important for me to explain, particularly as a physician.
Right.
And one of them is I don't think I'd like to live in a disabled body in a care center, unable to care for myself. But
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that I don't value the life of those people that do live that way,
Yes,
because
absolutely.
they're here to learn something, and they're learning something even in their disabled state, whatever their disability is.
And
And
they're teaching
sometimes
something.
and sometimes they're here to teach us something.
Yeah.
And so I want to make it expressly clear that I value every life, no matter what I might, from my perspective, view as a quality of life. I try to find out what the person's view is and honor their view and what their desires are relative to life and death and how they want to live. And I think it's really important to make that clear.
Mhm.
Um, with regards to assisted death, uh, there's a lot of semantics involved, and a lot of people don't realize this, but physicians have been quietly assisting people in the dying process for centuries.
Mhm.
And they just don't talk about it with the same language
Mhm.
that some legislators talk about it with.
Mhm.
They've been laboring to help people to pass in with dignity and to be free from pain and to minimize their suffering, but the way they approach it might be a little bit different than how others approach it. And so sometimes the accusations that get thrown around about these things or what people want can be misconstrued. Uh, um, so I don't have a problem with somebody deciding to end their life with dignity and in a pain-free way.
Mhm.
And I honor that.
Mhm.
And I try never to impose my views about these things onto my patients.
Mhm. And many people who go down that path towards assisted death, that it's merely by knowing that they have the choice and they have the cocktail. It's a surprising few who follow through to the end and take the cocktail. It's like somehow just knowing that they have a choice if it gets too bad is enough for them.
Yeah, when you talk about assisted death, that for some people, that's a real trigger word or trigger phrase. And some people like it and some people are really offended by it. And it's important to remember that everybody has different things that they feel that way about. For example, life support. It
Mhm.
was not at all uncommon for a family to fly in from out of state when their mother was passing and on life support, and they want everything done, everything. And you try to explain, we can do everything, but she's still only going to live a few hours or a few days, no matter what we do. Yeah, but you still have to do everything.
Right.
And a lot of times it's kind of based in, sometimes it's a philosophical view, sometimes it's a religious view, sometimes it's an issue of guilt. They haven't seen their mother in a long time. They want to make sure that everything's done so nobody can blame them of not doing enough.
Right.
And sometimes you have to help people recognize, wait a minute, what we're doing to her now is unnatural. If
Right.
we stop supporting her unnaturally, she will pass in a natural, healthy, wholesome way.
Right.
And so labels are really problematic sometimes when we start talking about death and how we assist people in passing with dignity.
Right. And I think that's why it's such a valuable tool for people to go through creating their advance directive that outlines not only the practical check the box of yes, I want to be intubated, or no, I don't want CPR, but to really, it's a tool that's to leave the best path possible for those left behind to uphold the wishes of the person who created the directive, rather than a physician or a family member imposing their
Right,
beliefs
right.
about it. So,
My wife, she understands my wishes. If she sees me collapsed in the backyard, she's to wait 30 minutes, and if I'm still there, then call 911.
yes, yes,
So,
that's been a challenging conversation to have with my kids and really anybody who will listen to me, because I don't want any type of heroics. I'm ready.
right. If I can't feed her myself, then don't feed me.
Right.
But everybody's different that way. And I want to add one little thing from a spiritual side too, because of my perspective with death and dying, and because of the communication I've had after death communications with so many souls. I would add this: every experience I've had with after death communication, the person has been profoundly happy
Yes.
and profoundly grateful
Yes.
for whatever care was provided them, regardless of the way things went. And I never worry about uh, how people are doing in the next life or how it's going to be when I get there. It never bothers me a bit.
Yeah, I have a deep understanding that death is the great equalizer. That no matter what your story was on this side of the portal, we're all doing just fine on the other side, um, and everybody gets, the review is not a punitive one.
No, no. In fact, I have a friend, she's a nurse in Pennsylvania, and I share this story with her permission. She was an emergency room nurse, and a gentleman came in that was Quaker or Mennonite, one of the local traditions. And he was in cardiac arrest, and they were doing chest compressions. And in the middle of chest compressions, she looked up, and across the room in the corner was this man standing, observing people trying to resuscitate his body. And they successfully resuscitated him. And she went and visited with him when he was well enough to speak, and he had an out of body experience, and he met the person that he believed to be Christ, and he was a Christian person, and he was of German extraction, and he was very by the book. He was very by the rules. And this person he met in out of his body that he believed to be Christ, he explained to him, I did everything right. I did everything I was asked to do. I did it by the book. I kept all the rules. And this person that he believed was Christ looked at him and said, it wasn't about the rules. It was about love.
Right. Right.
He lived the rest of his life quite differently after that experience.
Yeah, that is, yeah. When I go back to my near-death experience, I'm a very loquacious person, but that experience renders me absolutely speechless because I cannot find the words to convey that sense of love that I felt. That it wasn't an I feeling it; it was I was it. Um,
Yeah, yes, you are. You are the light.
yes, yes. I'm
Um,
curious how you, because I'm on the journey right now of traversing into, at first I kept the spiritual part of my work pretty covert. It was still what I did, but it was covert.
right, right.
um, a little while ago, maybe in the last couple of years, I got to the point of saying, you know what, my art is an expression of myself spiritually. It's a way of channeling that energy so that words can matter. They can hold an energy. So I uh, started making that journey of bringing my art into the forefront of my work. And now, especially with the guidance I'm getting and being called more and more often to be there to further the conversation about death as an integral part of life that is teaching us about love, how to live fully, how to I see myself as a bridge person between that love that I know I am to recognizing it even when it is messy here, to know that love is the source that is present here, even when it appears not to be. So, how did you decide? How did you evolve to leave your practice, your medical practice aside, set it in the background more, and step into using your art and your intuitive abilities, your intuitive gifts? How did you evolve those into a new practice, especially when business, once you are making money doing something, I know that, how do you cross that bridge and have a spiritual practice that generates an income that still holds the essence of just a gift, being a gift?
Well, that's a good question. I just had a conversation with a client this morning about this dilemma, and I confided to him. I said, uh, I haven't made any money for a year. Um, so what happened was I did some consulting work that kind of helped with the finances as I took this step toward what I'm doing now. And when I set up my website the way it is, and you probably saw my paintings and my sculpture and stuff on my website, um, and when I decided to do this intuitive mentoring, this spiritual mentoring, I just made a conscious decision. I'm not going to worry about the money. I'm going to do what feels right,
Yep.
and I'm going to set it up to help souls heal. Uh, and I'm not going to worry about the money. And that was a real easy decision to make when I had that consulting income. And then a few months later, the company was having some financial struggles, and they said, we don't need you anymore. We can't use you. So I haven't had any income for a year. And at one point, I was offered a job as a physician in a clinic. And I thought I couldn't really say no to the person because they were a friend. I said, let me think about it. And the moment I said that, there was just this heavy, dark, foreboding anxiety that settled in on me, and it lasted all night long. And the next morning, when I called her up and I said I'm not going to be able to take that job, it just vanished. All those hard, difficult, heavy feelings just instantaneously vanished. And I felt like the universe was saying, are you going to trust me, or are you going to go back to trusting yourself? And I could go earn money. I could do that. But I was being asked, are you going to trust me? I'm going to take you on a different path. And so now I'm trying to trust.
Right.
And I get a little bit of income from book sales, a little bit from speaking engagements, but not much. But I'm trusting, and I'm going forward, uh, trying to do what this phase of my life is. A friend of mine asked me, we were talking about this one day, and he looked at me and said, I think you're a healer. I said, oh, no, no. I can help people, but I'm no healer. And I never thought of myself as a healer for 25 years in the ER. I was just a doctor. And he said, I think you're a healer, and I think you should ask for permission to use the word.
Uh-huh.
And so later that day I did. I opened up, I got connected, and I said, is it okay to call myself a healer? And the voice that spoke to me kind of chuckled and said, of course,
Right.
I made you a healer.
Right. Right.
And and I had this flow of knowledge that the voice that was talking to me was saying, you being a great healer doesn't diminish me.
Right.
I'm okay. You,
Yeah,
you know,
it's the channel of that. You
yeah. So now I try to help people heal their souls.
Well, I think that I don't think is actually it. My experience as with my near-death experience somehow has the money thing just still doesn't make sense to me. So I hold your hand, I hold your kite string. I would love to, because I'm in that same place of knowing that it's important to, what is it? Einstein, the greatest question we ask our answer for ourselves is the universe friendly? So,
Well, I frequently meet with my clients over lunch. In fact, I do a thing called Lunch with Jeff, where you buy me lunch and I'll give you 2 hours.
uh-huh,
And I frequently come home from lunch and my wife will say, well, how did it go? And I'll say, I don't know if I'm ever going to make any money, but I have to keep doing this because I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
right, right,
I have these profound spiritual experiences with people, and
right.
I know I'm doing the right thing.
Well, I feel you're doing the right thing too.
Oh,
And
thank you.
yeah, and I am really grateful, so deeply grateful, to both you and the other Jeff, um, because I think it was that little voice that called me back into looking at my near-death experience and integrating it even further into the work that I want to do, because I really feel like any way that I can help people not be afraid of death and use that reality that we all have to face at some time, to see it with lightheartedness and humor and just a greater sense of peace that they're not going to be alone. Uh, that feels like my calling now. So I don't know how it's going to come together or how it's going to look, but I feel like I'm hearing of more and more people who are on that path. So I'm just grateful to have met both of you and grateful for your time today.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. I appreciate you letting me visit with you for a little while.
Yeah, great. Can you tell the listeners how they can get in touch with you?
Yes, my name is Jeff O'Driscoll, and you can go to jeffodriscoll.com. And if you don't know how to spell that, I also own the domain name helpingsoulsheal.com, and it goes to the same website. And I'm on Facebook, and my books are on my website. If you have Amazon Prime, you can order Not Yet on Amazon and not have to pay for shipping. So if you buy it from Amazon, I'm not hurt at all. If you want to order it from me, I'll ship it. And I also have children's books on my website. If you want the children's books, definitely order them from the website, not Amazon, because I had to jack up the price of the children's books to cover the Amazon fees.
Yeah.
But the order still comes to me, and I still put them in the mail. So just order them off my website if you want the children's books.
Yeah.
Um, and feel free to send me an email. Happy to visit with people.
Great, great. Any concluding message you want to share?
Yeah, about 20 or so years ago, I walked into a hospital room, and there was a gentleman sitting on the gurney, and he was kind of disheveled and tattered and looked worn. And he had long hair and a scraggly beard, and he had holes in his shoes and holes in his socks, and he'd been out walking around in the snow. And he was a homeless guy, and he struggled with addiction issues. He was the antithesis of everything the world says is success.
Okay.
And I filled a wash basin with warm water, and I put some soap in it, and I sat down at the foot of the gurney, and I took off his shoes, and I took off the last threads of what remained of his socks, and I put his feet in the wash basin, and I proceeded to wash his feet. And something profound happened.
Mhm.
Whatever it is, whatever we call it, whether it's a veil or some barrier between this life and the next, was drawn back, and I saw who he was.
Mhm.
I saw his eternal divine nature,
Mhm.
and I felt as though I was in the presence of the divine. And I went into that room thinking I was going to serve him, and I walked out realizing he was ministering to me.
Yeah,
And when I saw that in him, it changed the way I saw every soul afterwards,
right,
because that's who we all are.
right.
And when we can come to see ourselves that way, then we can come to treat ourselves and each other the way we should.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And I look forward to the next time.